Hello, everybody. James here. It's Franchise University with Shane Douglas himself, and this week I can change the cameras again. So we see we see the finger, we see the three fingers going on there.
The all broken and the yellow. This is good CBD stuff that I use. It actually works on my knee, but it stains the hell out of your hands. So
I'm going to apologise once more. Right, we were so close to getting some audio and video sorted, and then just for whatever reason, the laptop on the other end, on the American end, just would not accept it. So in the next couple of weeks, I'm getting a whole new system sent over to Shane and everybody else there at Appalachian Championship Wrestling to get it sorted. But for now, Shane, we are going to be talking about WrestlePalooza 1998, and it's one of those things where with your run in ECW, Shane, in the last year or so, you seem to be perpetually injured. I was like, at one point, you should have come out as like an entire body cast.
well, what happens when you're doing it? And I've seen 1,000 guys in the business do this. Once you get a character crafted and the character gets over, you don't want to go out there and be 90% of the character. So in the back, you'll be telling yourself, and you mean it when you say it in your head, I'll take it easy. I won't take any crazy bumps, that kind of stuff. Then you get in there and the adrenaline starts flowing. And okay, this is a wholly different, we're going to get into that in a little bit here, but this is a wholly different night. I should, in hindsight, I should not have been anywhere near the ring. But, they understand again how we were brought into the business. The old timers who did far less, right, as far as physicality, the slams and moves and things, a lot more holds and things like that. But at the time, fractured palate, which was excruciating, the worst injury pain-wise I've ever had. My elbow just had surgery on it, and we're doing all this stuff. I should have been nowhere near that ring, but we're going to get a lot more into that. But there's I love going back and watching these segments because several things stand out. I'll mention them as we get into it. But I would dare say, look, because WrestlePalooza was one of those shows that got a little less. It wasn't quite. It's not like when you have some of the greatest matches shows in ECW. WrestlePalooza rarely gets thrown into that. And I would say by today's standards, that was an incredible show, right? But it holds up. Even after close to 30 years, 25, 6 years, still holds up. And, it's interesting to go back and watch that stuff, for me, because whether the fans get this or not, I don't regularly sit down on a weekend and go, let's put WrestlePalooza. It's there, as you know, like been talking to me, everything's up there. There's a few cobwebs and stuff, but once we get into it, it sort of clears out. But I really do enjoy going back and watching those clips like that, in those shows, just to reminisce and bring it back. And then it confirms to me that what I believe the reason the fans still chant ECW today is because the product still holds up. I mean, it's definitely put a stamp on the business, better and worse.
I think this podcast sort of forces you to, well, it forces you to, or it gives you at least a reason to watch it with a critical eye as well, instead of like if something's on in the background, and you might point something out here and there, but it does give it gives us both an excuse to look there with a critical eye. But before we talk about the pay-per-view, as we always do, we will be talking about the news building up to, I haven't got the date in front of me, it's like early May 1998, it's like May 4th, May 5th, something like that, I think. And I'm going to give you a few just to build up, and then I'm going to ask you some questions about some of the news stories further on down here. But the main news is Antonio Inoki gears up for his retirement bout, a win over Don Fry, 4 minutes 9 seconds in the Tokyo Dome. Inoki would wrestle a joke match in early 2000 against a J-pop star, which weirdly I've actually seen, and man, that was hard to hunt out. An exhibition versus Henzo Gracie, and would tag with Great Sasuke, defeating Giant Silver and Red and White Mask in his final in-ring appearance in 2000. I think it's 2000, or there's one in 2001. Next bit of news is weekly Memphis Wrestling TV returns under the Power Pro Wrestling banner, with Randy Hales after nearly a year off thanks to Jerry Jarrett and Jerry Lawler selling USWA to a con man called Larry Burton. But that's a story, that's a huge story in and of itself for another time. In the WWF, existing contracts have been disregarded and performers are signing new guaranteed deals often worth substantially more than before due to company fortune skyrocketing thanks to Steve Austin. And Shawn Michaels would lose the WWF title and retire due to a back injury he sustained at the Royal Rumble that January. And Mike Tyson's WWF appearances would help WrestleMania 14 gain a near unbelievable 730,000 pay-per-view buys, and would ended up being the best $2 million or so that Vince McMahon ever invested in an outside entity coming in that sense. Now, this is what I'm going to ask you about. Mick Foley, around this time, has revived his Dude Love character, but this time as a heel with the dental flippers in and the hair tied back and all that kind of thing. And he would go on to wrestle the second of 2 consecutive pay-per-view main events for the WWF title against Steve Austin. What did you think of the Dude Love? Because there's sort of 2 versions of Dude Love, the bad guy version, the good guy version. But did he ever talk about Dude Love to you while you were training with Dominic?
No. That was he came up with the where the name Cactus Jack came from was in Clarksburg, West Virginia, where we wrestled many of our earlier shows. That was also the first night when the UWF crew came up that we'd spoken about before, where I would meet Eddie Gilbert. And they sell 2,000, 2,500 tickets. It's called the Nathan Goth Arena, packing out. And right down the road, there was a bar/bowling alley restaurant/bowling alley that was called Cactus Jack's. And we would drive by that every time going into and out of the town. So that's where that came from. And then Truth or Consequences, New Mexico. There's a story to that, and forget what it is, why he chose that. But no, the other incarnations, those were, as far as I know, later developments for him. But in that, I think it shows you like Mick's whole approach to the business. Where mine was more focused on the holds and the counters and the believability of it. Mick saw wrestling going in a way that, quite frankly, I think at the time was not necessarily ahead of the class, but he took it to a different level because, we had, these characters before and stuff, suddenly everybody was, Randy Savage, for wrestling when he was doing that, when he first originated that was a really over-the-top character, the whole getup and everything. But because Randy could go in the ring, people just sort of, okay, and accepted it. And that sort of started becoming the norm moving forward, where it used to be black boots and black tights. And then suddenly you have this little bit of a change. And, it shows, Mick's intelligence is that, he could get into it. Mick hated the gym. Mick's not the most physical guy. A little secret, won't tell anybody. He's not the most physical guy in the world, right? But boy, he was able to figure out a way and coalesce these ideas into something that fit his personality perfectly and was seamless for him and worked, and captured the imagination. And so you got one guy playing 3 distinctly different characters and could seamlessly move between those characters. That's going to be hard, because when you're playing one character, the franchise, you're focused in on just that character and the things. What would this guy do or not do? And, now suddenly, well, this guy might do it. This guy would do it. And this guy, could do it on certain days. I think it would make it really difficult. But again, it shows you Mick's intelligence that he was able to come up with these characters and then get them all over. Because I would seem to think, imagine Randy Savage suddenly doing 180 different characters on certain shows. You'd be going, what's Savage doing? Why is he, it would just throw a loop to you. Really is a testament to Mick. And, the thing about Mick is he so loves professional wrestling that when he came in, again, he wasn't going to be the guy with that Paul Orndorff body. Mick was, quite frankly, allergic to the gym. And, this kid with this hair-shaped body, good athlete, but, again, you don't strike him and go, I hope you look like that someday. But, boy, he really took what he had and made a lot more with it than most people do with a lot more, as far as on the basic building blocks. And when you watch that, like Mick, when we would be driving down the road, a lot of the discussions that we would have would be like aspirations to the business. Like, boy, wouldn't it be nice if someday you could wrestle in WWF? And boy, little I know, right? Mm-hmm. But those kind of conversations. And then Mick would, like, if you weren't paying attention, like he would just throw a comment in. And you'd be like, what are you talking about? And then he would go into this 5-minute segue. Like it was just sort of off the right side of the road here. And And so you can even see them, because I look, and those characters that he would later develop, at that time, Cactus Jack, but how his thinking process and stuff was, I'd say with the comedy tour, I would say, in another lifetime, Mick could have been a stand-up comedian. That the way his brain thinks, and takes something in the news and can twist around and make it funny, and that's very much in Mick's thought process, how he thinks through things. And I always, first of all, I have an affinity for Mick, right? We're brothers. I mean, we've always shared a connection when we came into the business together, we trained the same way. And for a large portion, really part of our career, we would call each other and say, hey, Bill Watts is offering this, and what do you think? And we really did kick a lot around the business side of that for, I'd say, first 4, 5, 6, 7 years of the business. And I'm a big fan of Mick, because he, again, starting out together, obviously, but just watching him and seeing that guys with a whole lot more as far as athleticism and look and all of that, come in and somehow can't find their way to the top of that heap. And Mick did it 3 times, right? And got all 3 of those characters over. Or actually 4, right? When you throw in the evil dude love, it's something else to watch somebody that you knew was that kid to come out and create that character. And here's the thing that I think permeates all of this, and it really puts a stamp on all of this. Ask any wrestling fan from that late 90s, early 2000s, hey, what about Dude Love? They don't go, Dude Love, refresh my memory, right? It's, instantly what it is. And that the same guy played all 3 of those characters, and they will give all 3 of those characters distinct, different personality. Well, this guy's cool, and this guy's this, and this guy's that. That's a testament to not do it once, but to do it 3 or 4 times.
Moving from there, more news. Earl Hebner is recovering after a heart attack, or I think it was a heart attack anyway. For whatever reason, I just knew he was recovering, and then I assumed it was a heart attack. Steve Regal around this time, and people don't really remember this because he wasn't on TV very much in '98, but Steve Regal officially signed with the WWF. Then they brought him in a couple of times, and then they just sent him away again for months, and then he came back as the real man's man, Steve Regal, where they would do vignettes with him shaving with a straight razor in the forest, and squeezing his own oranges and drinking the orange juice, pulp and all. As the
vignette. Real men do.
Oh yeah.
In fact, I'm gonna go to the forest right now. I'll be back. It's
with a straight razor and just your bare hands and a glass.
Well, I just do it with bark. I just scrape it off of the bark. It's put my face against the tree. Steve, good guy. Good hand, good wrestler. Always enjoyed watching him. I haven't spoken or seen Steve in forever, but back in the day, we were ran the roads a good bit together, and it's like, for me, he was one of those first guys that that I did a lot of traveling with, that had come from somewhere else, and had a very different upbringing. I grew up watching WWF and later NWA. He grew up, of course, watching Wide World of Sports. What is it? Dickie Davis and World of Sports Wrestling. There you go. But the thing is, it wasn't called World of Sports Wrestling. That's like the colloquialism, basically. It was All Star, or the promotion wasn't called that. Promotion was like All Star or the other one. Yeah. Interesting. I always had Wide World of Sports in my head for some reason.
Well, actually, World of Sports was sort of like Wide World of Sports, and it was just a collection of just all more odd sports. Like I'm sure in your version it was like roller derby or something. But over here it was it's the same thing.
Just throw it all together: the roller derby, the tiddlywinks, and all the those like. Lesser sports, right?
Yeah, I'm trying to think. What is the car racing one where it's half on tarmac and half on dirt?
Oh yeah.
I can't remember.
I know exactly. Well, then you also have the demolition derby stuff. Yeah. But yeah, those ones are the ones that they I know exactly what you're talking about. It's not nearly as big of. Auto racing here is gigantic. In Greensboro, North Carolina, they have a 120,000 seat venue, and they pack it, and people in them. there's going to be 150, 60, 70,000, maybe 200,000 people. And to me, and I'm not degrading anybody or just besmirching anybody. Just watching a car go round and round and round somehow seems to me to be just like, okay, I've seen that 103 times. And I understand there's a lot more to it than that, but it's like for me, I just never been a big fan of it, but it is gigantic.
Yeah, I used to watch Formula One in like the 90s, and it's easy to fall out of love with it because after you've seen so many races, And also, how do you relate to any of these people who, for the most part, were probably millionaires' sons who, could actually afford to get into that, into the first place? Anyway, we'll move on. Storyline-wise, we're going to go to WCW now. The most interesting thing is, it's WWF still, D-Generation X invading WCW by standing outside and getting their own fans to say WCW sucks, which is basically the meat of it, but it was funny. Here's something that's very interesting. At the same time, the WrestlePalooza pay-per-view was happening around this time. In WCW, Chris Benoit and Booker T were going through their series of swapping the WCW TV title back and forth on house shows. Now, this is in order to placate ticket-buying fans from not getting the advertised Ric Flair versus Kurt Hennig and Raven versus DDP matches. We'll talk about Flair in a bit afterwards, because, for several reasons, in fact. WCW, of course, then does not acknowledge the swapping of the TV titles between Chris Benoit and Booker T, and therefore pretty much killing those towns by telling them, hey, you're not important enough to, actually acknowledge these titles being switched. Is this a thing that WCW would do regularly, or any other promotion would do regularly? They'd swap the belts on house shows and then not acknowledge it?
Yes, that was done as like the pump houses. If I was in Dallas, Texas, and we did something in the house show, people in Pittsburgh, it's not like today where you all have cell phones and devices and there's all this, people taking pictures, videoing it, and then popping it up online. It was like being on another planet at the time, so you could get away with that stuff. In fact, when I was a kid, and I used to go to the Pittsburgh Civic Arena, as you're waiting for the show to start, you'd look around, are there any TV cameras here? Because if there was, you knew there was going to be a belt change or something. So even back then, as kids that didn't know anything, we were sort of savvy, I guess, in those ways. But yeah, they would do that. The switching of the belt was, hey, it's going to pop that house. They would then, in that town, explain and say, well, afterwards, the referee saw James had something in his boot, or they would throw a promo or something and explain why James doesn't have the belt. But those were called house angles, market specific angles. But it wasn't widely done. It wasn't like, hey, let's pop the house every week when we go there. Every weekly. But yeah, they would do it. But by this time, I think you can see like how I just explained it. Now, we're beginning to have the early vestiges of the internet and people talking and stuff, and the shows were so hot that that's what everybody's talking about and stuff. So if we weren't doing a podcast back then, because it weren't podcasts, and you and I were friends, I'd be going, hey dude, did you hear what would happen? And so it sort of permeated that way, and that's where you can see it. Wrestling, I think the biggest sin for wrestling is that it always tries to hold on to the tradition. There's definitely a lot of solid bones to. But then as the world keeps turning, we talk about this all the time when we're off air, all the crazy stuff going on. And as the world changes, we're still trying to hold on to 10, 20 years ago. It really starts to make it look dated and dragging and out of place. I remember in the early years of my career, and when I was a fan watching, just really degrading type of stereotypical plays on race and things that when you look back at it, it's so cringy. Everybody knows that every German was evil because every German had to be a Nazi too, and just the whole disparaging of African Americans and those types of things that we'd watch and see. Okay, that's best left in the book. But there was a time when the guys that were running the business, because they came from the period, because work back then, still let's try this. It's just going to make the break from that. And this is where we're starting to see where, the business is now becoming so huge, much bigger than anybody that was in the business at the time could ever have imagined. And I used to ask Bruno, could you imagine 50 million people watching wrestling. No, they knew they had a strong audience, 16,000 people every 3-4 weeks in the Civic Arena in Pittsburgh. But 50 million people would eventually be watching some version of wrestling or sports entertainment. That would have been like telling those wrestlers, "Hey, you're going to wrestle a unicorn next weekend." I mean, it was just a real tectonic change in the industry, where with all the social media and everything, suddenly people in England or Japan or Russia or wherever could see something online, and you would never in a million years have heard about them 10 years prior. So yeah, this is I think you start to see at this point, like when the Generation X did that. I remember watching it. And, I think some of those guys, but watching it, well, what a great idea! It's coming right down in your front yard and just basically giving you hello. Smart stuff. And interestingly, though, I would have loved to have been in that conversation how they convinced Vince to do it, because Vince, when I was there, both in 90 and 91, used to always say like, "Yeah, I love it, great idea, but we don't do that. Never give the other guys any exposure, because it's in this sense you're giving them some of your airtime to put up." And that, but so that's Vince's MO. It was Vince's approach to it. So they must have had to spend some time to convince him. But it's interesting because, like you said, that was what, 98.
Yep.
They did that, and in and around that time, 98, 99, 2000, we start to see where Bischoff starts to reveal the finishes, and they don't switch over. Mick Foley beats whoever.
That was actually he actually started doing that in 95 when Nitro came out, and then at the end, and then at the end of 98 when Bischoff was getting desperate, he started going back to what was happening back in 95 again, and that's when he told Schiavone to don't tune into the WWF. Mick Foley's going to win their title. That actually, so that actually started at the beginning of Nitro and carried on for months.
Okay,
and then he revived it, and then he wished he never did.
But sort of comical. You can see this. The behind the scenes wrangling between the businesses, and some of the stuff worked and much of it didn't. But in the end, it was hurting fans. The head-to-head stuff, even though it was such a huge part of wrestling history, it really was forcing James Romero to go, "I'm going to watch this one or this one," because this is before TiVo and all that, unless you're really sending VCR or DVD player that you can record with. But you were then forcing things to bisect, to bifurcate, because you can't watch both at once. You only Elvis had three TVs in his den. So yeah, it was, in hindsight, I'm sure there's a lot of it where those guys look and go, "Yeah, wish we hadn't done that."
Right. So speaking of Benoit that we were talking about a few minutes ago with the Benoit Booker T thing. Apparently, around this time, so we're going to talk about Flair more for a reason I've said. He had split from, he'd essentially been fired or suspended from WCW at this time a couple of weeks earlier because he wanted to go to his son's amateur wrestling meet, something like that, and he told Bischoff, and then Bischoff hadn't realised, and he booked him for Thunder. So apparently, and I'd only found this out a few days ago, is that the reason that Bischoff was so keen to have Ric Flair at this nondescript WCW Thunder show was because Ric Flair was going to be announcing a new 4 Horsemen, and you'll never guess. I'll give you 3 of them, and you'll never guess who the 4th one was. Where are we? Ric Flair's new 4 Horsemen would be himself, Dean Malenko, Lex Luger, and guess who the 4th one would have been?
By the way, there's more to this story, but go ahead. I have no idea. I've heard this.
Goldberg.
Really? Well, what? Ooh, I would have shot that. I mean, yeah, wow. Well, the backstory to it, as I know, was Dean Malenko had flown in. We were at WCW. We were in Philadelphia, and Dean popped in, which was sort of unusual. And so let's go out and get some sushi. So we went down to this great sushi bar down, I forget the name of the avenue, but a couple blocks from the ECW ring. And Dean and I used to have this thing where he would say, or I would say to him, "Hey, don't say anything till I'm done, and then reply." Just like, let me get through it. And we sat down, and I knew something was up his sleeve. And he finally said, "They're recreating the Four Horsemen, and it's going to be these people, blah blah blah, and they want you to be the Flair role. Bischoff wants you for the Flair role." And I said, "Well, we thought about it." And look, I was happy in ECW. I love ECW. I respect the war on Dean. Dean and I had a little hiccup there towards the end, and we've gotten back on track. So I'm glad to hear he's doing well. But he wasn't ready to leave ECW. I had unfinished business that probably would have. But I told him, he tell Bischoff I thank him for keeping me in mind. Yeah, hey, I didn't want to leave ECW. That was the biggest reason. And I also sure as hell didn't want to be the faux Ric Flair. I remember Paul wanted me to do his chop and his figure four and his woo. And I said, "Are you out of your mind?" I said, "I'm the guy that's out there burying, pointing out his foibles. Now I'm going to go out and emulate him." I said, "That just ain't going to happen." And I'm glad I didn't in hindsight, because what the franchise became was because there was that, brands, there was roots. You can see clear roots of the franchise in that. But there's that and a whole lot more. Hopefully, that was my intent. But so I just part of it would have been a lot of money and all that, I'm sure, on the table. But I didn't see. Yeah, I'm of the firm belief that the second anything is never as good as the first, right? And the Four Horsemen had been such an iconic imprint in the DNA of wrestling that it just didn't make sense to me. We're never, no matter how good we are, the fans will always say, "Hey, ain't those original guys," right? And again, playing the Flair Reed dance. I just didn't see myself in that role. But this is also around the time when that heat started with Bischoff, that Flair floated the idea of leaving, and that's when the arm would come up and all of that, and that whole conversation. And it was, I don't know, you'd have to ask Rick. I'm sure Rick would probably give you 10 different stories over the years on it. It sounded to me from Mark, because Marty's a pretty straight shooter. It sounded to us that this was definitely something that Flair was floating, and his biggest concern was what I shoot on. And so I made the counter offer right there without even talking to him. I said, "Tell him we'll do it," because we couldn't possibly pay him the kind of money. We couldn't say, "Here's $1 million." Even though Party would have made a bunch of money with it. Imagine if Paul had been able to be the one that brought Flair and Douglas to the world. I think it would have been incredible. But we just weren't in a position to pay that kind of money. So I, on the spot, made the counter 3 matches to show Rick my fealty. I'll lay down for him first in Charlotte. 50 minutes, 55 minutes. He lays down for me in Pittsburgh. We do the rubber match in Philadelphia at the Spectrum. Pay-per-view, give him 10% of the gate. And Marty had later told me that he really gnawed on it for a bit, but ultimately would re-sign with WCW. Rick's such a political creature. I don't know if he was doing that just to Bischoff, you better or else, right? Which probably smart on his part for his paycheck. But you wonder how Rick could have rekindled his career. As hot as ECW was at this period, and him bringing the stuff in, because when we finally did have the match in WCW 2-3 years later, I can tell you, if you go back and you watch that match, Ricky's laying his stuff in, and I'm firing back. He's getting return flat. But he stayed there toe to toe, and he earned a modicum of respect from me until the whole debacle of the finish. But this is all in that same time frame. So an interesting period of history, wrestling history. The what ifs. What if Rick had come to WCW? That boy, I think it would have, really, first of all, popped ECW for sure. It certainly would have elevated the franchise character, but I think it would have really refreshed and renewed the Nature Boy too. You know, it's ECW had a real knack of doing it for guys that had been off scene for, or on the downside of the ladder. And Rick by this time had become the rope Ric Flair. You know, every spot the same. You could almost. I remember watching with my son later after he was born, and we're watching the match. And I go, okay, he's going to do this next. About three. How do you know that? They said, if you ever watch a Ric Flair match, you can see it, and you can instantly call what's coming next. Right? And this was the Ric Flair. This was the period of Ric Flair. The Ric Flair story.
Moving on. Excuse me, there's a cough into the microphone. Buff Bagwell recently suffered a broken neck, 4 crushed vertebrae from an errant top rope bulldog by Rick Steiner. And the sad thing is that Rick Steiner wasn't being rough with Buff, to rhyme. He was being extra light. He ended up doing a top rope bulldog. His arm slipped straight off his head. Rick sort of ends up on all fours, and then Buff lands forehead first onto Rick, jacks his neck back like that, and he ends up with 4 broken or fractured vertebrae. And he would, Marcus would be back by the end of the year. But it's just one of those bizarre freak accidents that happen. A couple more things for... Yes.
That's real quick. That's called a Jefferson fracture.
Okay.
The Dr. Martin. So when you're in a car wreck and you get thrown forward, your head hits, that's what happens. It snaps your neck. And vertebrae are they're spongy. So they're very, very easy to break with just the right angle and just the right. So I was just talking to one of the younger talents at the show last night, show up in Winchester, Ohio. She's training now, real nice young lady. And I said, what we were taught, first 3 rules for us was take care of your partner or your opponent, take care of yourself, take care of each other. Those were the top 3 rules. And still, the margin of error is so, that's what always amazes me. On any given week, how many wrestling shows are there? There's got to be. And one slight slip like that, something just as simple as something the movie's part taken about 300 times in his career, does it just one time, something slightly goes wrong in 4 crushed vertebrae. I would probably say with 4, if Buff hadn't been so buff, right, no pun intended, he most likely would have been paralyzed, quadriplegic. That's what said Gary Wolf. The doctor said, man, you break like he had he that night in the dressing room, he's out there, they tried to pop his neck because he thought he had a kink in his neck. And thought Gary was, thick as a tree trunk. And if those guys had not been so muscled up, they most certainly would both either be paraplegic with Buff, certainly with 4 quadriplegic. And you go back and think of it from that time. And Matt, I was just watching an autopsy show about Chris Reeves, and I thought, my God, could you imagine that what an inner strength that guy must have had to be able to go on after something like that, because it's that's just unfathomable to me. And just yet on any given night, how many times we do this in careers, one slip, sweaty, these buildings are always hot, it's oiled up, whatever, and one just you do it 10,000 times, and yet that one time could be devastating. So, but you said Buff pops back by the end of the year, which was just astounding. And you wonder, again, in hindsight, looking back, because Buff was always clean guy, right? Clean eater, clean liver, all that. You'd occasionally see him having a beer, something like that, and then and then what would happen to us later, right? Going into this really dark chapter of our careers, and many of us succumbing to it. Many of us been in holes for quite a while from it. So you wonder, okay, Buff was able to bounce back, and that's a testament to him. But I'm sure the pain and stuff must have been permeating and lasting. And so, it's and you can't remember I said earlier about going out and not being 90% of franchise. You don't want to go out and give the fans 50% of Buff, right? You want to be Buff. You want to entertain the crowd. You want to give them their money's worth. And so we wrestlers, this is one place we're really stupid, is that we go out there and convince ourselves we can push it a bit. And when that adrenaline's flowing, anybody knows this. When that adrenaline's flowing, you don't feel anything. You could drop me off this building. And then 10 minutes later, when the adrenaline's flowing, I'm thinking, you should have done that. But this is I think we start to see with where in the business at this time, I want the fans to understand, especially younger fans listening, Prior to this, it was holds and counter holds and an occasional, like big bump. I remember like when a suplex was a finish. That was it. You're done. You got been suplexed. And then the superplex is coming. What was happening was this sort of arms race. Everybody's coming up with this newer and newer stuff. That margin finger is going. Ooh. And then we start seeing these injuries and self-medicating. And so again, like I said in the last episode, things our business should be embarrassed about. And this time the business sort of, well, you're an independent contractor, James, you're on your own. But if you don't wrestle, you ain't getting paid. So that mortgage you have, and the car payment you have, and those kids you got to feed. Well, sorry if you don't wrestle. And of course, you're going to self-medicate. What else are you going to do? You can't go to cops and say, "Hey, he's trying to make me earn a paycheck." So just again, the strange part. I'm going to write a book someday and go back and look at these different periods, and then what transpired in the business 1 year, 2 years, 5 years down the road. And I think somebody would stop and take a look at that and dig into that. You'd start going like, oh, okay, I see why we see this massive spike in the overdoses, and because look what happened a few years earlier. Sad part of the history of wrestling, but even on the best of nights, because of what we do, and we all know this. Everybody knows there's a chance, you might end up in the hospital. You hope not. You try like hell not to. But, it's part of the accepted risk that we take to do what we do. And by no means, we're going like the guys on the front lines fighting wars and stuff, nothing like that. But, the guys that sign on to this, you pretty much know if you have any kind of brain, your marriage is probably not going to survive this. You're going to end up really banged. You're certainly going to have injuries. And, at this time with the wrestling business, again, it was an independent contractor, not our responsibility. And, all of that kind of just really embarrassing stuff for an industry at that time that was grossing more than the NFL and the NHL combined. One company. So, sorry, James. You can't walk. Well, boy, you got some good matches out there. It's really scary and it's having you look back. It was just, it's in hindsight, looking back at it, it makes complete sense that we had all these injuries because we were rampant. A lot of these guys, when you watch the Road Warriors doing their electric chair, at the end, the clothesline off Hawk's shoulders. Once you go through it, depending on how Joe hits you with the clothesline, Hawk hits you with that clothesline. It's just a question of, does he hit you a little too hard and take you out of your axis and you come down on your neck? Again, the margin of error is, compared to like what Bruno's generation was on, Bruno broke his neck, so there's not what they were doing wasn't dangerous, but the risk factor was spiking this time. And again, we saw the outcome. So sorry for the little bucket sideway there. But yeah.
Mark Canterbury, Henry Godwin, he ended up getting his neck broken from the electric chair thing. Doomsday device, I was trying to think of the name. So, yeah.
They knew the name for it. But see, that everybody calls it electric chair, right? But these are, and again, I don't think that, Joe would never have thought that. They were stiff on certain things, but they weren't anybody wanted, hey, he's going to break his neck, it wasn't anything like that. But I'm sure Mark would be the first to tell you that. Just one of the, again, quarter inch this way, that way, different.
Well, there's two ways to take it. You can either do a backflip, or they can just let you down gently, like an electric chair. And I think he took the backflip version of it, and then he couldn't get over in time because he's a huge guy anyway. But
big boy, yeah.
Yeah, we're gonna move on. British Bulldog was refused to put over Scott Norton and was sent home from WCW. Randy Savage wins and loses the WCW World Title within 24 hours. And here's an interesting one: Mark Madden was removed from internet broadcasts of Nitro for a couple of different reasons, but the main one was he said that Hulk Hogan had a useless appendage and it was called Brutus Beefcake.
Line, but yeah, it's a if you're going to be the third announced guy going in and taking a shot at the top guy of the company, you might want to more carefully choose your words.
Yeah.
Says the guy that always spewed off, right?
Now, this is interesting because you mentioned that you'd seen Dean Malenko around this time, and I've actually written this. Merging WCW and ECW news, a number of WCW wrestlers found their way to an ECW show in Philly in April. This is just a couple of weeks before WrestlePalooza, including Chris Jericho, Dean Malenko, Eddie Guerrero, Meng, Scotty Riggs as well. The feeling was that all wanted out of their WCW deals. There's another thing as well that we can talk about afterwards, but yeah, so how often was it that wrestlers from other companies would turn up at ECW shows, and apparently, according to this report, all of them were just bitching about WCW and wanting to leave?
Quite often, and not necessarily always in Philadelphia. We would go to Florida, quite a few of the guys. I think in the industry, even though the line that pissed us off, but also put a fire on us. When Jerry Lawler, who's great, extremely crappy, ECW means extremely crappy wrestling. Right? Well, that was like a shot across our fans' bill and ours. We all, those are the new Jerry laughed at it. Well, typical Jerry, what a great line. But he was like, okay, well, we'll show you. And I remember Tommy one time, we had a conversation at the arena because these guys were always popping in. Tommy was always the conspiracy guy at that time, right? The young kid, didn't really know a whole lot at the time. They're trying to steal our shit and this. I do like the can't. I said, look, we have the luxury of doing this and then going home and licking our wounds for 5 or 6 days till we have to do it again. That time, well, no, by then we were going pretty good. But they, having been there and working in those companies, when you're on the road, you're on the road. You're on 10, 15, 20, 30 days. And there's no way in the world those guys could or would be able to do that, steal our stuff. And they might be able to mimic it here or there, which I think is what happened more like in the Attitude Era. But, I think all of them, once they got to see the guys, once they started meeting the guys and working with the guys, realized, okay, these guys, there's a little bit more to these guys than just, garbage can and garbage, right? Which was always the slam against us. But yeah, the guys were popping in, and I can't say they were all coming in and going, hey, Paul, can I get a job? It wasn't like that. They'd pop in and hang out and watch the show and, cut up with the boys and stuff like that. But, your face being seen and, Paul, the mad scientist, looking around saying, James Romero. He just sees wheels turning, and a week or 2 or 3 or a month later, he called, hey, James got an idea, and you either turn it down or take it. But there was a lot of that going on, and so like in that context, like the whole conversation I spoke about a few minutes ago with Arn, coming in and pulling me and Paul aside and proffering this idea out was not like holy smokes, left field, where'd it come from? Because this was happening quite often, and excuse me, also guys from WWF occasionally. It was and at the time you don't know if it's just they're pissed off because of their spot. You don't know what the dynamics that they're going through. So and you don't know if they're there like snooping around. Shane Douglas is doing this tonight, because that was always my thought when those guys coming in. But like when Dean and those guys would come, it was sort of like homecoming. Our brothers are coming back, and hanging out. And it was just always a good time. There was always an air in the dressing room of, family reunion type stuff. And not even like always when these guys came. When we would all see each other, we'd all be on our own way. And don't get me wrong, I was telling the girl last night, she was asking questions about it. I said, oh, there was egos in each of them. See, man, butted heads for a lot of the time. And, love every time I see him. Just a great period of our lives. And, so there's a lot of that going on. But yes, there were, and of course, then there's the infamous examples of Rude and wait for it, Brian. You get these names going through your head, with Brian Pillman. And, doing a show in WWF, doing a show in ECW, doing a show under contract here, and there was those things, and Rude had some kind of parallel like that, so these, the guys were floating around and stuff, and I think most of them came and realized, like, okay, if WWF is paying me this much and WCW is paying me that much, ECW can pay me that much. Well, yeah, except like when you sell your merch, you're going to make the lion's share of your merch. And, it's still, we weren't getting to the ballpark, but it was a lot less work. You're on the road a ton less. the thing I think that a lot of those guys didn't realize was that there was this guy, a really bad hairdo named Paul Heyman, who had an amazing creative gene, and rekindled how many of those careers. I mean, you look at, we've talked about this before. You look at the WC or the ECW. On paper, a whole bunch of mid card, low card guys and a whole bunch of guys that nobody ever heard of. And Paul gets a lion's share of that. He damn well deserves. But I was talking last night in the car back to a friend on the way here to Moose's. The missing part of that equation is he had an amazingly talented team that could execute his game plan and do it almost flawlessly. I mean, you look at Nugent, all the crazy stuff that he did, but God dang, that guy had charisma. I mean, Jesus, he oozed it. And, that's one of those intangibles that you got and you don't got. I mean, you can't teach somebody charisma. And so, he threw garbage cans and hived off the stuff and everything else. But for the people that just deride Jack in that way, compare your charisma to his. And there's a reason that he was drawing like he was drawing and got ensconced as he got ensconced. And he should have fans behind. Part of that, certainly part of the fabric and the flag that became ECW. But there was all that going on. There was, but that it was. If we had a show tonight and these guys popped in, it wasn't like what's he or she doing here? Because this is quite often like when they come to Pittsburgh, I'll pop in and say hello to the guys, and a lot of that went on. So it wasn't like glaringly on the surface, like, hey, something's going on. But there were quite a few of those guys that were in conversations with us, people they knew, would say, I remember Pillman when he came, said, "Oh, it's shit down there, it's shit. It's shit down there. There you go, it's shit." And so you could sort of get from the way he's talking, like he ain't happy, and I think that's where Paul started, like, again, his wheels started. Okay, he's not happy. Brian's a pretty damn talented guy, and comes up with this idea, and Brian, taking him, he had this idea, the loose cannon, and boy, I think at times he tried to live up to that gimmick a little too much. There's a time to turn it off and put it away. You go out and you get in a taxi cab and you start just hammering this guy with really derogatory comments. This guy could shoot you and call the police, say you tried to rob him or something. Like, dude, plus give the guy some respect. Just kick us out in the middle of the city where we don't know where we are. Just things like that you go back and look at and really pop out in your head. But very talented, and this happened quite often. And at this period, like you're pointing, this is like where this really started becoming almost like, hey, let's just go hang out and see what's going on, and because again, as we were talking about Marvin Gaye earlier, something going on in ECW, right? So and it was catching the gestalt and the zeitgeist of the wrestling audience and the boys in the audience because they knew something was going on.
One more bit of news, and this is going to be an interesting one. It's one of your old friends I'm going to reference as well. Sid, no shows, a card. Supposed back injury. For a New York indie on May 1st, he was meant to be wrestling Ahmed Johnson, who also no-showed his dates because he refused to ride to the venue in a Nissan Altima. Dennis Corluzzo, who I suspect you've met before, Dennis Corluzzo, a few times here and there, ends up giving... You wrestled him?
Dennis Corluzzo twice in my life, face-to-face, met him twice in my life.
Really? So you never did any NWA, whatever it was, dates for him? I know it was a conflict of interest with Paul, but...
Well, I met him the first day I remember meeting him. I was with Eddie Gilbert. We were driving somewhere when Eddie was still at ECW, and we stopped at the Renaissance Hotel by the Philly airport. He had to pick a paycheck. Eddie had worked from 92 earlier, and he had to pick his paycheck. And we met in the lobby. I should say they met instead. And as a passing thing, Eddie said, "Oh, Shane, meet Dennis Corluzzo." We shook hands, and I don't even recall if we had any conversation. It was, "Hey, how you doing?" type of thing. And then the next time I would meet him would be the night the NWA title was thrown. But I'm pretty sure that's the only two times I ever met him.
So Dennis Corluzzo, after Ahmed Johnson refuses to turn up, ends up giving Ahmed's hotel room number and phone for fans to yell at him. And he was getting phone calls all through the night for no showing because he was being a big star. Okay, right, so this really relates to no shows. We'll talk about Sid first. Is how, and we were talking about, weirdly, no shows off air as well, of people who can be a bit flaky purposefully. How unreliable over the years is Sid, or is he only unreliable with indies but always reliable for the big companies unless he's got a softball match on?
Yeah, well, fairly common. It's in fact, I was talking before we got on the air to I was up in Canada, and the promoter up there said, it's in the course of 19 days, I'm talking about everything, and he said that he had Sid booked. Talked to Sid the night he'd been talking because he was a winner, the reputation. And, said the night before Sid called and said, like, hey, how's the weather up there? I want to make sure I bring the right clothes and all of that. Gets to the airport to pick him up, and Sid calls and said, can't make it. And just he didn't know why he pulled out. So, we still hear this periodically today. You'll be at a convention and somebody will say, Sid was supposed to be here, but you know what the rest of the line's going to be. It's more shocking to me when I walk in and somebody goes, "Oh, Sid's here." Oh shit, Sid's here. He's actually here. You can go see him. I've always gone along great with Sid, but it's just hard for me to imagine how, like, when you hear these stories, they say like Justin, incredible, like constantly no showing people. Sid doing this pretty consistently, and you wonder, like, okay, so who's the next guy to go? Well, I'll take the chance, right? Because you have a pretty good chance that he ain't gonna be. And so, it's we still hear this consistently. Hear it every single weekend. You hear this. 2-3 times a year, you'll hear somebody on this. Sid supposed to be this. I'm not aware because you don't follow this stuff. I don't get on the computer all looking at this stuff. I'm not aware of when's the last time that Sid made an appearance. I haven't heard his name for a while.
He no-showed his own podcast. Apparently, he had a podcast out like a couple of years ago or a year ago, or whatever, and then he just no-showed it. Just went completely off the radar. But it was his podcast, and he just disappeared.
Well, James, sorry, I gotta go. You're going to softball.
Yeah, I'll see you in 4 years.
yeah. Who knows? It's what goes to these guys. What I ultimately think of Sid is I don't think Sid has a love for the business. Like me getting even now. I look back and I'm appalled that I've even had this career because when you come in, you're so fish out of water, and you're constantly reminded. Not like the guys would say it to you, but you just watch their matches and go, man, I'm never going to be that good. And you just watch. So, but there was like a drive in me. I wanted to, and I still stand in awe of the business after 40 years. So, like, I told my son this the other night. He's up from Tennessee. Great to see him. They from the time they were born on, their dad was a former world champion, and so like always on the top certain cards and stuff. But I told them the other day, I said, there was a whole lot of my career before you were born that you didn't see. That wasn't quite so rosy. That wasn't quite so lofty. That wasn't quite so, big money. But that's what you need to get there. There was a time when Paul Stanley and Gene Simmons from Kiss worked in a middle school as a typist, and I drove a cab. You look. So what we know now, and we look at Kiss today and see the legacy, the 50-year legacy they left behind in the mountain of music. It's pretty cool. It must be cool to be Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley. I'm sure it is. There was a time when it probably wasn't so cool to be Paul Stanley and Gene Simmons, and but they built it. It takes the time. And so when you wonder at guys like Sid, if he wasn't this imposing physical specimen, and he is, any by my size trying to pull that would have been like, yeah, next. We don't want a kid that ain't going to show up. But because he was so imposing, that he has that, and this is not a smirch towards Sid, there's a lot of people I see in my business that don't really have, well, I think especially today more than ever, but even then, there were a lot of guys that said, well, I can use wrestling to get from here to there, and especially now, like when you look at, Dwayne and Cena, by the way, great spot by Cena on the Huskers the other night. You watch, you watch this and you say, okay, great, good stuff. They've created a new avenue for the boys. So you can see how young talent coming to the business. I had no desire. There was no thought in my head. Maybe I can use wrestling to get to here to there. My whole thing was, because it was like saying, okay, I'm going to go to Pluto. Yeah. The idea of getting into wrestling and then being successful in wrestling would have been saying, okay, I'm going to grow a pair of wings and fly around the planet too. Just impossible. So I just think there's a lot of Sid and a lot of guys like him. That's no slam. They get it. Especially a big guy like him. You could, many jobs for a 7-foot, monster like that around, the towns where he's from or any place. But, wrestling, suddenly you're set apart. You're something special in wrestling. And so, no slam him. And God bless him, people still trying to book him. So after all these years and all these no shows, people still trying to book old Sid.
Who's the, leaving Sid out of it, who's the flakiest? Who's you just never know if they're going to show up or not?
So right now, PJ. I love him to death. PJ is, I tell people all the time, he's a good kid. I say kid because he's a lot younger than me. But, and an incredibly talented kid in the ring. He's damn good. When he wanted to go, he was damn good. A couple of years, 5-6 years ago, we were on a trip and I said to him, look, you're the world champion. This stuff is past. But it's very clear when you look at the industry today that there's a huge need for somebody that can get in the ring with these kids and do how we were taught. Take them by the nose and teach them. No, we don't need 24 more backflips. Calm down. We're going to set something and start to get them to feel and understand the nuances of our business and the storytelling. And it's not just go, 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 go. It's great. I mean, it's great that it's incredibly physical, but it's not wrestling. And, I told him this, and I said, get the weight off. Get your weight down, get yourself back in shape, and go make your family some money. I know. I'm going to. And then, I love him to death. He's one of our brothers, right? But it breaks my heart when I hear these stories and I see, what's going on, because I don't want to see anybody. We've had plenty, more than we should. And we're at the stage of our lives now where we ought to be able to sit down and meet fans at conventions and listen to their stories, and you hear it every night. I used to love watching you. Hated your guts, want to test, dump you. All those types of incarnations of things you hear. And then, you get yourself like sort of locked into this self-created cell that you can unlock and get out of. And then guys like Pete just don't, or they just don't know how, or just don't have the intestinal fortitude, whatever the reason is. But we know how that movie ends. I've seen that movie enough to know how it ends. And I certainly don't want them for Peach. So there's a lot of guys in the business that are like, it's not necessarily flaky. It's just quirky. And unprofessional as hell. We talked before we got on the air today. The guys get there. Well, James, this podcast, we went up 10 people. So, I want $10,000 a week before I'm leaving. How unprofessional, how embarrassing. I'd be mortified. Because again, like I always say this, if I come here and I look down and go, 3 viewers, James, don't pay. So it's a two-way street. You're taking the risk. And I fervently believe that anybody that I work with and sort of give my word to can live up to whatever the agreement is. Not, I can get in for a few more bucks. Yeah, and my dad used to say, when they put you in that, nobody's going to say he was handsome, he was tall, he was short, he was a great athlete. They're going to say he was a good man or he's a bad man. And I fervently believe, I would much rather have the world say, hey, he was a crappy ass character. He was mean as hell. I hated his guts. But the man, Troy Mark, was a pretty good guy. And I guess a lot of these guys have no inkling. doesn't, I guess, strike their fancy. It's important to me. I always tell my own kids, you either have principles or you don't. There's no such thing as half pregnant. You're pregnant or you have principles or you don't. And if you don't, then you're just a prostitute. Hold on, James. When's bluns? Yeah, this is the answer, right? And it's, just pay me an arf, arf, arf. I'll bark like you want me to bark. It's you have them or you don't. I think a lot of people in our business sadly don't. And I think that, if I can play psychologist for a second, they do this. And I think in their heads, they say, well, it's okay because 2 years ago, that promoter screwed me and ripped me off. It doesn't mean that you should rip these fans off too. It's ultimately that's what the night that I dropped the belt to Taz, and I sorry to keep going on this, but this is pressure to what we're talking about. When I pulled into the building, and I won't tell the whole boring story, but I knew I was getting screwed. I had already laid down for Taz in less than 3 minutes, and all this 2.5 years of doing this, being the triple threat, and then Paul comes up with an idea that just happens to be me dropping the belt whenever I promoted a ton of money from the company, and I pulled into that parking lot, and I physically could not get out of the car. My ass was glued to the car. I could not open the door. And all the boys are coming like, what are you doing? What are you doing? What are you doing? And I finally drove away. Screw it, I'm not doing it. And I'm getting screwed. I'm not doing it. And Bammer called me. I was down the road to the bar drinking a beer. And he goes, what are you doing? I said, I'm here. I'm going to come down. He goes, and we talked for a while. And Bammer said, do you think, they said, I just want to ask one question. Do you think the fans deserve to get screwed because of Paul's bullshit? And that's what, no, they don't deserve to get screwed because of Paul's bullshit. And so then I resolved, I'm going to go there and tear the fucking house down. And did, it does. So, and all these things go together. I could have no showed, walked away the belt and then told Paul, it's going to cost you this. Let's get rid of it. And that would have been fair. I certainly have right. I have an obligation, more than an obligation, to protect my family. But the fans that made ECW, they were the ones that created magic that was ECW. And we were the guys that were in there sweating, taking the bumps. But those fans coming back every time and pushing those tapes around, talking, and still today, ECW, those fans did not deserve to get screwed because without them, we would have never been. And so it all goes together. There's a lot of flaking. I've been flaky in my career.
I don't know the story about you and Taz then. So you say you were getting screwed by Paul then. So what was Paul doing to make you not want to drop the title to Taz?
I remember like it was yesterday. Paul used to pay us a per diem, right? So your hotel, your rental cars, that kind of thing. You give him the receipt. He'd pay your pay and then X number of dollars above that. And I forget if there was a limit to it or I don't think there was. Let's say your rental car was $100 for the weekend. You'd get your pay and you'd get $100 on top of that, or whatever your per diems were. But he then took the receipt so that he could write that off of the company, which is only fair. Well, Taz, love you to death, Pete. Taz wanted to keep the receipts too. He wanted the money and the receipts. And I remember he and Paul having it out one day at the building. And as Taz walked away, Paul looked at me and said, Taz is going to do his first job to you. Because he was pissed about this conversation. And that was where the whole thing came up. I would never have, for the year and a half build up to that angle, I would never have let him beat me in less than 3 minutes, backpedaled and run from him. Because now you beat me, franchise got no heat. He's just a character. And I was well versed enough in the business and I understood that. And I was owed a boatload, $77,000 that I was owed. Take that belt off, and I have zero leverage to get that belt. And as it came the week of the show, which was we flew into Orlando, which was in Kissimmee, just south of the show. And Paul called me Monday or Sunday of that week and said, and called when he knew I couldn't answer. So he just leave this, sort of drop pop this message in. Give me a call. I have an idea. I knew as soon as I heard that what he was going to try to pull. And so I tried literally all day Monday, all day Tuesday, all day Wednesday and Thursday. No calls, nothing. So on Friday evening, I called him and I said, Paul, I've been trying to reach you all week. I'm going to wait at my house. It's like 9:45 at the time. I said, at 10 o'clock, if I haven't heard from you, I'm leaving and going to get drunk. I said, I won't be there. So I waited at 10 o'clock. I mean, at 10:01, I walked up the door to a bar, door tavern, Kelly's Saloon. And started about midnight, Paul starts to call. So this is the fucking one thing Paul Heyman hates, be out there, wants to rib him. He hates being hung up on. He's call, hello, click. Hello, click. About six or seven times he called, he goes, are you going to keep being a baby or are we going to talk? I said, no, let's talk. I said, I'm not going to be there tomorrow. I said, I told you, I'm at the bar right now. I said, well, we ordered you something. So we talked until 7 o'clock in the morning, till daylight. And he kept, I swear on my father's eyesight. And, and I said, I finally told him, I said, okay, well, I'm going to fly down. I said, but the first thing I'm going to do when I get there is going to sign a promissory note, not from ECW, as Paul Heyman, that you owe me this money. And my lawyer had written this document up and sent it over. And I fly in, my driver picked me up. And as we're pulling out of the airport, on the Orlando airport, onto the freeway, we used to stay at the Marriott downtown. And Paul calls. And I answer the phone. And he said, no, it's all this drama. Is this about me or is it about you doing a job? The guy that suggested Bill McGillicuddy pinned me, the guy that let Taz beat me in 3 minutes, Sabu beat me in 3 minutes. I was in fucking incensed. And I said, what the fuck are you? So I'm at the Marriott at the Orlando airport. I looked over and here's the hotel. I grabbed the wheel of the car on the freeway and yanked it and we spun around. So, what are you doing? We pulled into the hotel. I was going to beat the shit out of him. So pissed. And then get back on a plane and leave. And I went in and they all, Francine and Ron and Charlie and Bubba and Diva, and they're all sitting in the lobby. I said, what room's Paul in? He said, I'm going to see him now. I said, give me 15 minutes. Well, the door was open. He was waiting for Bubba, right? So I get there, push the door open. Paul's in the shower. Now, let me tell you, there are things that cannot be unseen. He said one of them is like watching Jabba the Hutt get out of the shower with that 3 hairs that he had, like wet straggling down behind of that white pasty body.
It's not John Cena at the Oscars, is it?
Yeah, not quite. Just a hair difference. And he comes out of there and like, just starts trying to apologize. I pulled the document out of his sign. We had very little conversation, and he kept saying, why do you think I'm trying to screw you? I said, the paper says it all. I said, I understand this business. You beat me. I have no leverage to get it. So now I've got the guarantee to get the money back. And but when I got to that building tonight, I just couldn't get out of the car. And then when I did go back to the building, when I walked in, they had Dave Marquez was in. I think it was Dave Marquez, and he said, "Oh, you're not allowed on this one. You have to go here." Well, just because he said I wasn't allowed there, and pushed right by him, was like, "I'm going to do what I want to do here. You can kick me out if you want." I walked over. Francine came over first and locked the door. So I had this huge locker room to myself, and Franny going, "Not go away. Don't talk. Leave me alone." And come and say, I said, "Go away, Franny. Hear this." Well, goddamn shame, Douglas. I come up and go over and lock the door to Terry. Terry comes in. I told him what was going on. I said, "What do you think?" He goes, "Well, goddamn Shane, you're getting fucked." And I knew I was getting fucked, right? And it was just infuriating. And Taz came over, and Paul had been telling him he doesn't want to lay down for you. And I said, "Pete, seriously?" I said, and told the whole story. He didn't know that the inception of that storyline started the night he bitched him for receipts. That Paul said the Taz would do his first job at the franchise and all of that. I said, so now if you look over that last build up to this, it all makes sense now, doesn't it? Would I have laid down? Would you lay down for me if I'm going to beat you ultimately? And and Pete and I have always gotten along great. So I explained to him because there were 2 things I knew he was going to do. Taz would always do this thing on the falsies where he would start to pick his leg up or start to move to kick out. as when you're doing a false finish, as soon as you move an eyelash during 1, 2, the fans consciously or subconsciously know you're kicking out. And so the pop, instead of being here, drops to here or low. So we were using the wall. I put my shoulder against the wall. 1, no motion. 2, no motion. 3, 2 and 9/10, explode. No motion till you explode. So you watch back, he gets those right in the minute. He gets like I told him. But then he also used to do a thing, if you remember, when Taz would win, he would grab the belt or whatever and climb the ropes. And I told him, I said, do not do that tonight. And he said, why? I said, because the fans are going to know that this is a passing of the torch. And even though those fans love to hate me, they respect what I've done with the belt. So just don't climb the ropes. You'll be fine. So we did, there was, Taz, Candido came out and Tammy, and then Blue came out, and there was, really exciting ECW finish. And he chokes me out. I never tapped. I pass out. Belt goes to him. And I'm laying there selling, and I hear, fuck you. Oh, my eyes are looking at the audience, and the audience going, fuck you. Fuck you. They're pissed, right? And I'm like, damn, I engaged everyone. I thought they'd be sort of upset when they lost the belt. Even though they would be happy as the story was that these other fans respected me. And then I realized they're not telling me, fuck you. I'm going to roll over and Taz is up on the ropes. And he never just screamed, get the fuck down. And he didn't, and he left. And that was the whole incarnation of that match. But we tore the house down, literally. We fought all over the building that night and really gave the fans a money's worth. And as I was coming back, I did an interview with Dave Shearer and Bob Rock, and just sort of opened up. I told them that ultimately Bam Bam's the reason I was here. And the next week, Paul wanted me to come back. And we put Taz over again in the arena. Okay, no problem. Because now, if this is the game we're playing, I'm going to go out and get the franchise character. And I knew Taz would be able to hold his own. But so I go, I'm going to get a little bit of the childish side of it. But Paul used to always tell me, I forbid you to cut your hair. So snip, cut the hair all off and show up the next week looking nothing like the franchise character, classic franchise character. And it would make say he wouldn't say anything. But here's the thing about it. I want the fans to go back and look at this. From the outside looking in, you would assume, because of the run I had in ECW, that me and Paul was 2 peas in a pod. I can't recall a time that Paul and I ever had a drink in ECW. I don't recall, although I'm sure there must have been time. Well, I remember we used to go to the Honolulu's in Boston, but we rarely broke bread. And any time we had any kind of meeting, it was usually with multiple people in the meetings. If you look at the opening of the show, Franny has 3 shots in the opening of the show. Taz has 3 shots, prolonged shots. And Tommy has his, Raven has his. The franchise literally gets, well, there's these 2 little blurbs of, I'm supposed to be the guy. I'm supposed to be the foundation company, the champion. And, that was very much a love-hate relationship. Paul knew that I was the guy for that spot. At that point in my career, everything, all the stars had lined up right. I was at the exact point in my career. But there was no, I think Paul certainly respected me, but I don't think there was any love. There was no camaraderie there. It wasn't like, hey, we talk to each other every week and, hey, what's going on in the Scars though today? No, 0. And, that would bear out in ways, good and bad. But I thought you'd heard that story. We had talked about it.
No, we've never talked about it. And it's a great story too. I didn't know that story at all. Because to be honest, we're almost at the end of our time. We've not even got to WrestlePalooza yet, so we might as well just save the pay-per-view for the next episode. There's a couple of notes had left for after, so like post pay-per-view that I wanted to bring up. So we might as well go to that, and then another 2 episodes we can dedicate to WrestlePalooza coming up. One of them is Eric Bischoff. And when we talk about WrestlePalooza, as I say, we're going to talk about Ric Flair more because there's a reason why, because you cut a promo on Flair, and then you also mentioned Bischoff, so that'll all come clear when we, actually do it. But Eric Bischoff, after the DX invasion that I'd mentioned prior and that you'd referenced as well, changed, and it's actually very clever in a way. He changed WCW being on the back foot to then getting in the ring and challenging Vince McMahon to a fight. Now, there'll probably be a couple of questions here, but do you think Eric Bischoff, and he did practice karate, he was doing tournaments and stuff like that for a good few years, do you think he would have beaten up Vince McMahon, or Vince McMahon would have got the better of Eric?
Well, Vince is a big guy. And
he's also the clumsiest big guy, possibly, of all time in wrestling. He may have even just fallen over on the way to the fight.
Yeah. Well, it's one thing to be around wrestling, and you get into that gym, and he had the trainers there, and the people making his meals and everything. A lot easier to get into shape if you have somebody there. You have your own gym, you have somebody there pushing you, making your meals for you, your protein shakes, all that. A lot easier, and a lot easier if you can get growth hormone and the anti-aging stuff, which women do this. It's a medically recognized modality, but I would dare say Vince ain't a tough guy, and I think Kevin Kelly, but Kevin's a big guy. Yeah, Vince,
This is Nails, by the way, not the announcer Kevin Kelly you're referencing.
No, Nails, yeah. Who maintains a cult status to the boys in the business that he was, able to do what he did to Vince.
He'll be at WrestleCon as well,
Is he going to be?
Yeah, he's going to be there, so yeah.
I haven't seen him in forever, so that'd be great to see him.
Yeah.
But Vince ain't a tough guy. Yeah, if you grow up fighting like so many people did back then anyway, you sort of learn how to respect other people because there's always somebody tougher, but also how to take care of yourself. I don't think Vince ever had to worry about it because he was, Vince McMahon Sr.'s boy. And always around wrestlers that, always wanted to buddy up to him because he's daddy's son and all of them. So yeah. But Eric, legitimately, had competed and all of them. So on that bet, I'd put the house, Bischoff.
And when you were working in WCW, so I've heard this from J.J. Dillon, not personally, but I've heard an interview with J.J. Dillon from so many people. Eric himself will say, I never tried to put Vince out of business. That was never the goal of WCW. That everybody else who's ever talked to Bischoff says, the first thing he ever said to me was, what do you think it would take to get Vince out, to kill the WWF out once for all? Did Eric Bischoff, from when you knew him, I guess in 93, although, there wasn't as much competition in 93, but in 99, 2000, when, he was there and not there and in and out and all that kind of thing, did he ever express to you he really hated the WWF or he really hated Vince McMahon? Or did he see it as business competition?
Competition, yeah. Like, Luke and I weren't close enough to have those kind of, talks in that direct of a way. When he called me, when I finally spoke to him, going to WCW after I left ECW, the conversation was fairly brief. He made a very gracious offer. And he said that he wanted to be the one to bring Flair and Douglas to the war. And so like I knew he was well aware of what we were saying and doing. And it was sort of ironic because a few years before that, Damian Farron passed away several years ago now, was the head of ECW merchandising. And it started off as my driver. We became best friends. My kids called him Uncle Damien. And Damien was pretty smart. He picked up the working stuff. Damien would go to WCW shows because he knew a lot of Steve Pillman and I would often help, maybe pick them up and take them to the buildings and hotels and stuff. And he saw, they're all hanging out in the bar and drinking and having a good time. And he sees Bischoff tipsy heading towards the elevator. So he goes and gets on the elevator with Bischoff. And he's pretending he's drunk, and he said, hey, what about Steve Austin? Steve this and Pillman. And he kept throwing names on him. he was, semi-gracious to most of the names. And he said, "What about Shane Douglas?" And he said, Bischoff stopped, sobered right away. He goes, "Shane Douglas couldn't draw flies with shit." And so sort of ironic that a few years later he'd make the offer that he did to me and want to be the one to bring Douglas in that too. Look, and we all say things, right? Especially when we were in that head-to-head competition and fighting. I certainly never took very much of it personal, unless somebody said something personally about me. The funny thing is even when Flair would make his lame attempts to take a shot at me, it was always at Shane Douglas or the franchise. It was, I don't recall anything. I'm sure there must have been. I don't recall anything at the top of my head. Oh, hey, Troy Martin, by the way, is a teacher, and his school ought to know what he's doing on it. There was never anything like that. It never got into any kind of. It would take time even to know the names. But teachers, and at least we used to have these things called morality clauses that forbade you from doing anything that would be considered amoral. And so one day kids in my class are sitting back in the class, are passing something around, they're all laughing and like looking over at me. Okay, so I sweep over there, right, and they got a picture, a piece of paper. They put it off the computer. The night early in ECW, when we launched the franchise character, we did the nightclub stuff. I'm out there dancing with the girls and get out of the limousine with all these girls and everything. And Paul starts having them undress me. So they take my tie off. They unbutton my shirt. They unbutton my shirt. And they start with my belt. Right away, stop. Cut. And, the kids somehow got a picture of, me half unclothed and these girls undressing me. I would have probably been fired. Picture it going. Ridiculous as it sounds. Okay, well, if I would have been, I'm going to see in a movie like this, because it was very much about the outward appearance to the community. You're teaching people's kids, and now I watch teachers taking kids to nightclubs to walks. It's crazy. Like that something's changed, because at least, like I said, we used to have morality clauses. So yeah, and that became a big deal to us. Like wrestling was not yet that mainstream at that point. Early 93, 94, that kind of thing, where somebody's, oh, okay, well, he wrestles on the weekends. And my school knew that. I had permission from the school to leave early on Fridays. But I didn't saw, he must put black boots and black tights and go on and, grab holds and stuff, and talk to fucking music and all that, all the, just craziness of the franchise characters. So, yeah, funny stuff.
Yeah, no, I have at least one teacher friend who had to take down their Facebook because every photo of them on it was them just rolling on ketamine or whatever it is. Some of the it's every single photo. So you thought, you know what, social media is just not for me. just
probably not a good teacher.
Yeah. I'm going to ask you. I'm sorry, Karen.
Go ahead.
No. I was going to move on. So
I'm just going to say, you can understand how, like any parent, if I'm teaching your kid, and you see this fucking, and all the franchise characters, you can see your parents go, oh, my kid's seeing this. It's so there was always this sort of like kayfabe that was going on. Like, well, I'm going to wrestle. Would never really get into it. I don't think I ever told them the name of the company. I just gave them. Of course, all those beanhead PhDs, right? They're not going to the channel. Just watch some wrestling and see what this Martin guy's up to. It's.
I'm going to end it on this one, right? Not this one, but there was talk of Ultimate Warrior going to WCW. This is shortly after Eric Bischoff has said Ultimate Warrior will never be in WCW, and then a few months later, of course, he is. Also, what happens is the Brian Pillman Memorial Show, organised by Les Thatcher, raised more than $25,000 at Narwood Middle School in Ohio. I know you've done. I think you did a Pillman show, didn't you?
Yes, I believe it was that.
Right, I looked at this one. This is the 98 one. I think you may have done the 99 one.
Okay. It was like late. In fact, that was that night, when again, confusing the time frames here. As I'm talking about this, I'm trying to coalesce it in my head. Where there was the Nobody come after. This would be the first time that I saw Dean Malenko and Chris Benoit after some of the stuff that had happened, and we there was a bit of a terseness there, but by the end of the show, everybody that was there for the right reasons, to raise money for Brian Stanley, and that's the part of wrestling is as cutthroat as wrestling can be. Like the Brian Hildebrand show that we had in Ross Rader. The guys that were there because they loved Brian. Anybody that ever met Brian Curtis, they loved him, and just was a intoxicating guy because he was so fascinating and likable. And then he died of stomach cancer. So when Brian, and you see this, the boys that are always trying to cut each other's throats and stab each other in the back, but sort of coalesce around and come around. I think because all of us can imagine, there but the grace of God go I. This could be my family. And if that would, God forbid, happen, I would hope there'd be, some circling the wagons. So the Les Thatcher is the one that created that idea. I think I know it was in his company, and he was very close to Brian, as he might a lot of guys. And I don't know anybody that ever met Les that didn't like him. Just a very likable guy, very knowledgeable. And it was again, it was called, I remember Dallas Page being there, I think, at least the one that I was.
Yeah, so you were. I'm just looking here. You were on the third Pillman Memorial, and you were facing. Yes, you lost to Dallas Page, 13th match out of 15, and the main event was D'Lo Brown and Eddie Guerrero defeating Perry Saturn and Dean Malenko.
Yeah, it was very talented show. Very great, big names and everything. But again, you see this becoming the yearly thing, right? Boom, boom, boom. It's consistently doing this, and helping to raise the money for the families. And that, again, because as cutthroat as wrestling can be, and it is, you'd see that kind of stuff and go, okay, so these guys do have heart in there somewhere. It's, but it was like, it was sobering to see, that the guys would, reach out and take care of and help. Because again, any of us could look at that and this could very easily have been me, and but yeah, it was. I think also when we got to that, was that there was always the banter, the typical dress room banter between the guys, but it would always gravitate to, hey, remember when Brian did this or Brian did that, or this one time Brian did this thing, and it just sort of became like a laugh fest. We're just reliving that, remembering it, because I remember getting the phone call when he had died. I believe it was in Indianapolis, if I'm not mistaken, days in.
Yeah, like hotel room, yeah.
And it was a kick in the gut, because Brian, anybody ever met Brian would tell you he was so fun. Like Brian would explode into a room, Brian just didn't slip into a room. And you hear this going, like, what? Brian Pillman died? Like, he was so young, so vital, so energetic, and so over the top with personality, and it's the larger than life personality. And then they just seem so, because if I recall correctly, again, and you see how some stuff mismatches in my head, he was like one of the earlier ones, like one of those first couple of years of this. Little did we know it was coming right around the corner. This just constant onslaught. But yeah, Brian was like I remember us all talking to the people that I spoke to. There's got to be more to the story. Who was he talking? Like the Gino Hernandez stuff. We'd all heard those types of whispers in the business, and so there was a lot of that. Like there has to be more to this story because damn, and little when we come to realize what was actually happening, the build with the opioids and everything, and the more. Like at the time, I remember thinking, like, so he took a Percocet and died. Like it just didn't make sense. But it's even that. I talked to Brian Pillman Jr. And what I do when I talk to these guys that knew their fathers, like Bama's kids, and I'm sure, like for the people listening to me talk, they hear the over the top affinity and love for these guys and respect for these guys. And I'm sure, like just like me, you might not believe this, James, but I get a lot of farts and warts and foibles and just one clicked a little perfect, quite perfect. Mr. Perfect, one step, but you know, so when I talk to these guys, what I want to do is I want to convey to them the type of person, like that. Because Brian was just tiny. Well, they were all small. I think Shane was 12, 13, 14 when his dad died, like in that range, and he was the oldest. And I want to tell them stories, just the stupid things we do on the road that hopefully extends to them the humanity they're doing. That not perfect by long shots, none of us are, but the sense of humor they have, the loyalty that somebody like Bammer had. Bammer would walk into bullets if he was your friend. Just those things that they probably may not have. And when I was talking to Brian Pillman Jr., I told him, even then, like all these years later, reliving it and recounting it in my head, I said, it just seemed to me like it had to be that somebody slipped this into him, that somebody do something. Like Pillman, you couldn't, he was so, like I said, that door would open, it was a tornado coming. I don't mean like Tasmanian devil blowing everything over, whatever. Just this presence would come into the room. And just when Brian was in the room, you knew Brian was in the room. Who's that kid over there? And so it just seems so implausible. And I hope in telling these stories to those kids, it extends to them what kind of person their dad was, and a little bit of humanity, hooks and farts and foibles and all of it. But also that there was a funny side of their dad. There was a intense side of their dad, and the loyalty stuff. Hopefully extend it. Because I would hope that if something happened to me or something happens to me, that someday somebody will sit in my boys and say, your dad was an ass, but if he told you something, you take him at his word or whatever. I'm glad that I'm still around to be able to extend those stories to those guys, because I'm sure it's going to be a gaping hole.
On that note, we are going to close down this podcast. I know we didn't talk about WrestlePalooza. I hadn't realised how much sort of news, sort of like before and after the pay-per-view, we were going to get to, and where that'd lead. But it's always entertaining, regardless of whether we stick to the script or not. So we'll do the pay-per-view next week or the week after. We'll see how we go. But for now, Shane, take us out.
I appreciate you being here, sitting under the franchise learning tree. Come back again next week to hear about WrestlePalooza, and you know that James and I will never lie to you. See you next week.